Hi, welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, it's giant animals from the 1970s movie time. But before that, this video is brought to you by the wonderful Patreon supporters of the channel. You can be one of them by donating at patreon.com/Terry Talks Movies, and you get an instant +5 charisma score on your stats. But let's get on with the movies. The 1970s was an era when movies were starting to just dip their little toe into the pool of ecological awareness. Of course, the way that any Hollywood studio deals with and addresses any important social or cultural issue is by jamming it into horror movies first. The first one I've got for you is by MGM, a big studio, and it was based on a novel by a guy called Russell Braddon. The novel was from 1964. It was a satirical Australian science fiction novel, The Year of the Angry Rabbit. Now, Russell Braddon was a bit of a weird guy. His first book was called The Naked Island, and it was based on his experiences as a prisoner of war in the Changi prison camps in Singapore during the 1940s. He was an art collector. He was a bit of a polymath. And in 1964, he wrote a satirical novel about Australian politics. It's also about the rabbit plagues that Australia experienced since the 1830s, when some idiot farmer near Geelong released a whole bunch of English rabbits into the Australian ecosystem because he wanted something to shoot. They then spread across the country and became a plague. And in fact, at the start of this movie, Night of the Lepus, they have some documentary footage from the 1940s of farmers and other rural people fighting rabbit plagues near a place called Kerrang here in Victoria. This is the only reference to Australia that this movie, which is based on a very innately Australian novel, has at all. Now, Kerrang's about 3.5 hours from here. I've driven to Kerrang in a day and looked around. It's up near the Murray River, very flat country, not a bad place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there. So, leaving that aside, MGM decides to do this horror movie about giant rabbits infesting farmland in Arizona because nothing screams Australian political science fiction satire like Arizona. The 1970s was an interesting era in Hollywood because there are a whole bunch of experienced actors with name value who were dumped when the studio system collapsed in the 1950s. A lot of them did episodic television, a lot of them got series to do, and a lot of them went to Europe to appear in films over there and played on their name value. So you've got a cast of name actors who aren't at the best point in their career. The main stars of the movie are Stuart Whitman playing Roy Bennett and Janet Leigh playing Jerry Bennett, husband and wife team of scientists who are looking into ecologically friendly ways of dealing with various kinds of mammal pests in farmland. They're looking at ways of understanding bats, for instance, when the movie starts. And they're doing good solid science. They've got a young daughter called Amanda who's as annoying as hell. They have a friend called Elgin, played by DeForest Kelley from Star Trek, rocking a really nice mustache, who hooks them up with a farmer called Cole Hillman, played by Rory Calhoun, another actor who was part of the studio system in the 1950s, went to Europe and did movies there. Cole has a problem. Rabbits all over his farmland. And so the husband and wife team of Roy and Jerry start investigating hormones and other things to control rabbit populations. Basically what they're trying to do is do gender transitions on the rabbits, make the male rabbits less masculine so they don't reproduce, and making the female rabbits less fertile. So they've got cages full of rabbits and they're trying to do experiments. And then their kid comes along and basically destroys everything. She's given one of the rabbits as a pet, but what the parents don't know is that she swapped one of the rabbits who was injected with the hormones for one of the rabbits in the control group while their backs were turned, literally. And so she's got a pet rabbit which has got all of these hormones in it. They go and visit Cole's farm and she kind of plays with Cole's son and her rabbit gets away. And that then leads to a plague of giant rabbits in Arizona. The sheriff's not happy about this. He's played by Paul Fix, who's the other actor who played a doctor on the Enterprise in Star Trek. He was in the early pilots, the Menagerie pilot, playing the ship's doctor. So you've got a little bit of a Star Trek thing happening between him and DeForest Kelley, which is kind of cool. So, of course, the inevitable happens. Giant rabbits start rampaging across the landscape. They kill people, that they don't eat them. They're trying to find food, so they rob a guy who's got a truck full of produce. They're vicious, and they kill a whole herd of horses for no good reason apart from the fact that Rory Calhoun liked horses. And they become a real menace, and the townspeople and the scientists have to find a way to kill these rabbits before everything goes pear-shaped. It's a bad movie. Right up, it's a bad movie for a couple of reasons. First off, they made a decision with the special effects, and of course they had to use live rabbits, and they made a serious mistake by getting the rabbits to lollop along in slow motion, and that makes them look less scarier than rabbits normally do. And they also use domesticated rabbits, which are kind of round and fluffy and furry and little cuddly balls of fluff, rather than wild rabbits, which are lean and mean and look like they could outrun a jaguar. So you've got all these big fluffy rabbits running in slow motion through miniature landscapes, which are quite well done. The miniature work on this is pretty good. In fact, the miniature work in both of these movies is pretty good. You've got these rabbits, which are supposed to be about the size of cattle, running along, and they look ridiculous. Now, I did a little bit of an experiment, and I sped up the rabbit footage in this movie 3 times. And having the rabbits rampage fast through the landscapes works a lot better. Let me know what you think, because I'm going to play the slow rabbit footage as it appears in the movie, then I'm going to show you my sped up version of it. You tell me which one looks better. So the people have got to find a way to deal with it, and they end up electrifying a whole length of railway line, luring the rabbits across the line and having them all be electrocuted by this railway line. And then everything goes back to the status quo. The actors are pretty good. I mean, Stuart Whitman, 10 years before, got an Academy Award nomination for a movie called The Mark, where he played a pedophile, oddly enough. And Janet Leigh, of course, had got an Oscar nomination for Psycho. And Rory Calhoun was never going to get an Oscar nomination. DeForest Kelly's a bit of fun when he comes in. He was a much more charismatic actor than he was ever given credit for outside the realm of Star Trek. He did some film noir in the 40s. He played Morgan Earp in Gunfight at the OK Corral with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas, but he was never a big actor. But I think he had the chops to do much larger roles than he was ever given credit for outside of the works of Gene Roddenberry. You've got to watch this movie with your tongue firmly in your cheek. The silliness of it is really part of the 1970s. What the hell were they thinking? Horror, science fiction cinema. I kind of like it. I think it's rewatchable. I think it's kind of okay if you accept those stupid rabbits. To be honest with you, the original source material, The Year of the Angry Rabbit, is pretty much unfilmable. It was a broad satire. Russell Braddon wrote the original novel sitting in his bathtub over 4 weeks, so he didn't give it a lot of thought. If you look at the Wikipedia page for it, it'll give you a synopsis so you can get the idea of the bullet that was dodged by moving the movie to Arizona and ditching pretty much everything except the giant rabbits. So Night of the Lepus, very much one of those things where MGM was spending money to try to regain some prestige. They tanked in the 1960s as a studio because they spent a lot of money on some very silly productions, mostly musicals, which pretty much bankrupted the company. And so smaller films like this were brought out in the 1970s in order to get a bit of cash flow happening. And this one did not help their cash position. But again, it's part of that ego thing. Don't mess with Mother Nature because she will bite back in the form of giant rabbits with ketchup all over their faces. That then brings us to Bert I. Gordon's second attempt at an adaptation of H.G. Wells' really interesting novel, Food of the Gods. The original novel's name was The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth, written by Wells in 1904. And I think that there's actually the opportunity to make a really gonzo streaming series out of the original novel, keeping pretty much what's in the novel. It's a kind of apocalyptic book, and Bert I. Gordon only stole some of the base ideas from the first part of the novel for the 2 movie adaptations of the novel that he did. The first one was Village of the Giants, which he did in the 1960s, the one with Beau Bridges and a whole bunch of teenagers taking over a town after eating some goop, which turns them into giants. Great soundtrack on that one, but it's not a fantastic film by any means. So that came out in 1966. Then in 1974, he had another go at it with The Food of the Gods, with a cast that's kind of interesting without being tremendously distinguished. You got Marjoe Gortner playing Morgan, a football player who goes off on a little bit of a break with two of his mates, one of whom's a manager, another is a PR guy for the football team he works for. And while they're on Bowen Island in British Columbia, which is where the movie is filmed, one of his friends gets attacked by a giant wasp and dies and doesn't look good in death. Morgan comes back with his friend Brian, played by John Cypher, and investigates what the hell happened and why the autopsy report says that his friend was stung by about 100 wasps. Now, Marjoe Gortner was a weird, interesting actor. Started out as a child evangelist for his parents, who were a couple of con artists. He was the youngest evangelist in the world at one stage. He kind of parlayed that into an adult career. There's actually a documentary about him called Marjoe, which is an interesting piece of 1970s documentary filmmaking. But yeah, not the best actor in the world. He played the crazy guy in Earthquake a couple of years after this. Yeah, I don't think he's the kind of guy who can hold up the lead role in pretty much any movie with much success. They meet a woman in a cottage, Mrs. Skinner, played by Ida Lupino in her second last film role. And she and her husband, Mr. Skinner, have found some goop that is pouring out of a hillside, which makes their chickens really large. And Mr. Skinner's gone to the mainland to try to sell this to somebody and make them some money. They're both very religious, so she thinks that God has given them this special food. It turns out the goop is basically second cousin to Larry Cohen's The Stuff, in that anybody who ingests it's not going to have a good time. So Mrs. Skinner has a whole bunch of chickens that are grown to the size of large ostriches, and Morgan has an encounter with them. She has mason jars full of the food of the gods and is silly enough to let wasps get into it, and also the rats that infest her house get a good dose of it as well. So a businessman with whom Mr. Skinner was cutting a deal, a guy called Jack Bensingham, played by Ralph Meeker, comes along with his secretary, Lorna, played by Pamela Franklin. They come to get the stuff and to talk to Mr. and Mrs. Skinner, not knowing that Mr. Skinner's been attacked by giant rats and dies in a VW bug somewhere along the road on the island. And the whole group ends up being bailed up by giant wasps, giant rats, and they have to do something about it. I saw this one when it was in the cinemas, when I was misspending my youth. And yeah, it's very much kind of 1970s drive-in fodder. The special effects works pretty good. And Bird-Eye Gordon, who died recently at the age of 100 and something, did pretty well because he didn't make the rats slow like the rabbits were in Night of the Lepus. He makes them move at the speed that rats normally do. So you've got a lot of split screen work in there. You've got some really nice miniatures created for particularly the farmhouse, where the rats attack the farmhouse to try to get to the people because food. Of course, the businessman played by Ralph Meeker is a total arsehole, a total greedhead, and you know he's not going to end well. Pamela Franklin's character Lorna gets the hots for Morgan because stressful situations make you horny. So Ida Lupino playing Mrs. Skinner is the most valuable player here. She gives a bit of credibility to this older woman living on a farm who's worried about her husband and is not particularly bright and is also very religious and can't see outside of her limited worldview. So she's kind of good in this one. I like what she does with the role. The big stars in this are the rats. There's a white rat that controls all the other rats, which is a very 1970s thing. And so the people bail up in the farm. Morgan, for some reason, has a whole bunch of shotguns and a ton of ammo, and he makes some pipe bombs to try to blast the rats away. He doesn't make them well because, based on my limited knowledge of demolition, the way he makes the pipe bombs means that they'll just basically fizz like giant fireworks because he hasn't sealed the top end of them properly. So eventually they find a dam, because of course there's a dam, and they go the naked jungle on it by blowing the dam and flooding out the rats and then just taking out the rest of them, because the rats, having increased in size, have too much body mass to swim and they drown in the floodwaters. I kind of like this one more than I like Night of the Lepus, even though I do like Stuart Whitman as an actor, and it's got DeForest Kelly in it and all that kind of thing. It kind of leans into the silliness. It's got a lot more blood and guts when they blast the rats, and I'm not too sure about whether any rats were hurt during the making of this movie. It looks like some of them might have been, which is definitely points against it. Keeps that limited cast and limited geographical area that you need for this kind of a movie on this kind of a budget. And the kind of foggy, rainy Bowen Island locations really give it a sense of place, which is important in these movies as well, as indeed was Arizona in Night of the Lepus. But yeah, they're a bit of fun to watch. They make a good double feature. There was a sequel to Food of the Gods in the 1980s called Gnaw, G-N-A-W, Food of the Gods 2, which I didn't watch. I watched the first 3 minutes of it and it bored the shit out of me, so I stopped watching it. Night of the Lepus, mad movie, one of the weirdest films that MGM made in the 1970s when they were actually leaning into science fiction. They made things like The Omega Man, and they also made Soylent Green. But this one was definitely a failure on their part because the premise was too silly and the special effects work just didn't work. But as a double feature, they work. If you want to sit back and just enjoy some 1970s eco-silliness, you could do a lot worse than watching these two films, to be honest. Revisiting them was a bit of fun. I kind of liked sitting down and watching them and going back into that 1970s cinema headspace, but I don't think I need to watch them again for a while. There's so much else out there to enjoy. A little bit of science fiction, giant animal eco-horror. I could also do things like the frogs and slugs and a whole bunch of other movies of that era, which were really clumsy attempts to send an ecological message to an audience full of horny teenagers in drive-in movie. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment. You can also support the channel at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. Got some ideas for next Saturday's science fiction one. I've got a couple of other videos I'm going to do in the meantime. I'm actually putting it in an extra video in every week now, where I can just ramble about whatever I feel like in the movie realm and not impact the stuff that people are watching already. So that's kind of fun. By the way, the pom-pom on this hat is really soft. It feels like a baby kitten. Anyway, until next time, look after yourselves. Watch some good movies. Watch some bad movies. Watch some old 1970s eco-horror movies that aren't good, but are entertaining. And I'll catch you next time.